Welcome to Mr. Sleep Story, where stories come alive to guide you into peaceful sleep. Tonight, we journey into the mystical worlds existing in our collection of enchanting tales, where mystery, adventure, and wonder weave together under the glow of the moon. Close your eyes, relax your mind, and let the rhythm of my voice carry you to faraway lands. Today, story begins in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Squire Trelawney, Dr. Livesey, and the rest of these gentlemen having asked me to write down the whole particulars about Treasure Island, from the beginning to the end, keeping nothing back but the bearings of the island, and that only because there is still treasure not yet lifted, I take up my pen in the year of grace 17, and go back to the time when my father kept the Admiral Benbow Inn, and the brown old seaman with the saber-cut first took up his lodging under our roof. I remember him as if it were yesterday, as he came plodding to the inn door, his sea chest following behind him in a hand-barrow. A tall, strong, heavy, nut-brown man, his tarry pigtail falling over the shoulders of his soiled blue coat, his hands ragged and scarred, with black, broken nails, and the savor of old ship's biscuit about him in the hot, dry wind. I remember him looking round the cove and whistling to himself as he did so, and then breaking out in that old sea song that he sang so often afterwards. 15 men on the dead man's chest. Yo-ho-ho, and a bottle of rum. In the high, old, tottering voice that seemed to have been tuned and broken at the capstan bars. Then he rapped on the door with a bit of stick like a handspike that he carried, and when my father appeared, called roughly for a glass of rum. This, when it was brought to him, he drank slowly like a connoisseur, lingering on the taste, and still looking about him at the cliffs and up at our signboard. "This is a handy cove," says he at length, "and a pleasant, sitiated grog shop. Much company, mate?" My father told him no, very little company, the more was the pity. "Well then," said he, "this is the berth for me. Here you, matey," he cried to the man who trundled the barrow. "Bring up alongside and help up my chest. I'll stay here a bit," he continued. "I'm a plain man. Rum and bacon and eggs is what I want, and that head up therefore to watch ships off. What you mought call me? You mought call me Captain. Oh, I see what you're at. There." And he threw down 3 or 4 gold pieces on the threshold. "You can tell me when I've worked through that," says he, looking as fierce as a commander. And indeed, bad as his clothes were and coarsely as he spoke, he had none of the appearance of a man who sailed before the mast, but seemed like a mate or skipper accustomed to be obeyed or to strike. The man who came with the barrow told us the mail had set him down the morning before at the Royal George, that he had inquired what inns there were along the coast, and, hearing ours well spoken of, I suppose, and described as lonely, had chosen it from the others for his place of residence. And that was all we could learn of our guest. It was not long before the stranger began to show what a rough life he had led. He would stay all day long in his room or on the cliff with a brass telescope. Seldom he would even take a turn or two along the beach, limping on his injured leg. And when he did so, he was always on the lookout for passing ships. At other times, he would sit in a corner of the parlor next to the fire, and drink rum and water very strong, and stare straight ahead of him. He seldom spoke with us, but when he did, it was always with a gruff expression. And he paid my father generously for the trouble he caused us. The only name he went by was the Captain, and this he did not deny. But whether he had another name or not, we could not tell. He did not keep himself to himself entirely. He would join the few that came to the inn at night, but his sea stories, though well told, were often terrifying and gruesome. His manners and vocabulary seemed to have a strong effect on my father, who, though he had faced many a sailor, was somewhat afraid of our guest. I remember the night when he sang his sea song and thumped the table for emphasis. The other men stopped their own conversation and looked at him in alarm. And then he would demand silence, glaring from one face to another, and people found it hard to deny him. But there were moments of strange fear that clung to him. I remember, on one occasion, his pacing back and forth, muttering to himself about a one-legged man. The words, "He'll find me yet," escaped him in a tone so forlorn that even I, a boy, felt pity for him. My father, hearing this, thought it unwise to ask questions, but I could not resist. "Who is the one-legged man?" I asked. The captain turned on me sharply, his face pale and fierce. "That's none of your business, boy," he snapped, and his sudden anger frightened me so much I did not ask again. From that moment, I avoided him, and though curiosity burned in me, I was glad to stay out of his way. Despite his strange behavior, the captain paid well for his lodging, and his gold was always welcome. My father was ill during these days, and I was often left to help run the inn. But the captain's stay was far from uneventful. Though he seemed to be hiding from something, or someone, his time at the Admiral Benbow would soon bring much more excitement and danger than we could have imagined. It was one January morning, very early, a pinching, frosty morning, the cove all gray with hoar frost, the ripple lapping softly on the stones, the sun still low and only touching the hilltops and shining far to seaward. The captain had risen earlier than usual and set down the cliff with his telescope under his arm. A feat I had found he practiced daily, for, as he said, the sea keeps no regular hours. Now I was upstairs in the room where the captain slept. I had been tidying up and moving his great sea chest to sweep beneath it. It was the first time I had dared to open his belongings, though the chest was not locked, and inside I saw strange and foreign objects. A quadrant, a few curious shells, some bits of scrimshaw carved with intricate designs, and at the very bottom, wrapped in a piece of sailcloth, a packet sealed with wax. I did not dare to meddle further. A sense of dread crept into me as I replaced the chest's lid and finished my chores. That very day, something happened to confirm my growing unease about our guest. It was mid-morning when a stranger appeared at the inn. He was a pale, tallowy creature, scarred and sinister, with a voice like a thin rasp. He had but 3 fingers on his left hand and carried a stick which he thumped on the floor with a peculiar rhythm. He inquired at once for the captain, describing him in exact detail and asking if he was presently lodging with us. Before I could answer, he pulled me closer and hissed, "Tell him there's a friend looking for him." When the captain returned, the man was waiting in the shadow of the doorway. There was a moment of recognition, and then an ugly scene erupted. The captain, already pale with drink, turned as white as a sheet. He bellowed in rage, striking the man with his stick, but the man laughed cruelly, seeming to enjoy the captain's terror. "You'll be seeing more of us," the man said, "and don't think we'll forget about Flint's business, matey." With that, he left, leaving the captain shaking and muttering curses to himself. From that moment on, I knew our lives were tied to a dangerous game, and the shadow of the one-legged man loomed larger in my mind. Little did I know how deeply I'd be drawn into the dark secrets of Treasure Island. It was not long after this that there occurred the first of the mysterious events that rid us at last of the captain, though not, as you will see, of his affairs. It was a bitter, cold winter, with long, hard frosts and heavy gales, and it was plain from the first that my poor father was little likely to see the spring. He sank daily, and my mother and I had all the inn upon our hands, and were kept busy enough without paying much regard to our unpleasant guest. It was one January morning, as I was setting the breakfast table for the captain, and my mother was upstairs with my father, that the parlor door opened, and a man stepped in on whom I had never set my eyes before. He was a pale, tallowy creature, wanting 2 fingers of the left hand, and though he wore a cutlass, he did not look much like a fighter. I had always my eyes open for seafaring men with 1 leg or 2, and I remembered this one puzzled me. He was not sailorly, and yet he had a smack of the sea about him, too. I asked him what he wanted, and he said he would take a glass of rum. When I had brought it to him, he drank slowly, like a connoisseur, lingering on the taste, and still looking about him at the cliffs and up at our signboard. "This is a handy cove," says he at length, "and a pleasant, sitiated grog shop. Much company, mate?" I answered him that we had very little company, and the more was the pity. "Well then," said he, "this is the berth for me. Here you, matey," he cried to the man who trundled the barrow. "Bring up alongside and help up my chest. I'll stay here a bit," he continued. "I'm a plain man. Rum and bacon and eggs is what I want, and that head up therefore to watch ships off. What you mought call me? You mought call me captain." He threw down 3 or 4 gold pieces on the threshold. "You can tell me when I've worked through that," says he, looking as fierce as a commander. I went at once to tell my mother about the new guest, and we were talking it over when a 3rd man joined the company. He was a seafaring man, but more plainly dressed, and he too had that suspicious, watchful look about him. When the captain came down and saw him, his face turned deadly pale. The newcomer was none other than the man who went by the name of Black Dog. Black Dog greeted the captain with a loud voice. "Ah, Bill, mate," he cried, clapping him on the shoulder. "It's been a long time since we've had a chat." The captain, whom I had never known to tremble, sat staring at Black Dog like a man who sees a ghost. Then he burst out swearing at him. Black Dog kept his temper and looked at him steadily. "Now, Bill, mate, you're in the wrong of it," said he. "We're not here to argue. I just want to have a talk, like the good old shipmates we were." The captain stood up, and with a sort of savage look, he slammed the table with his hand. "Talk, is it? That's all I'll do with you, Black Dog, and precious little of it." They sat down at the table together and began talking in low voices. I could not catch much of what was said, but now and then I heard the name Flint, and at times it seemed they were arguing fiercely. Suddenly, the captain sprang to his feet, drew his cutlass, and with a cry of rage lunged at Black Dog. Black Dog was quick and dodged the blow, springing out the door and running up the road like a deer. The captain hesitated for a moment as if he might give chase, but then he reeled, clutched at his chest, and fell to the floor. I ran to help him, but his face was ashen and he was breathing hard. "Rum!" he gasped. "Bring me rum!" I fetched it quickly, and he drank it in great gulps. His strength seemed to return a little, and he sat up against the wall. "I've been a fool," he said. "I should have known they'd find me. Now it's my old shipmates after the map. But it's not them that'll get it. It's you, boy. You keep an eye out for a one-legged man." Then he sank back, his eyes closing, and for a moment I thought he was dead. But soon he began to breathe more easily, and the color returned to his face. He was still weak, but he waved me off, muttering, "Leave me be. Leave me be." I went back to the kitchen, my mind full of what I had seen and heard. Black Dog was gone, the captain was gravely ill, and the mention of Flint's map and the one-legged man had filled me with foreboding. Little did I know how soon all these things would come crashing into my life in ways I could never have imagined. When I returned to the parlor, the captain was lying as I had left him, on his back, with his eyes open and one hand pressed to his side. "What's wrong?" I asked him. "It's my chest," he said weakly. "I'm having one of my old fits. It's the rum, you see. I was warned against it. I've lived on rum these years past, and it's been my ruin. But I'm a warning to you, boy. None of that, none of that. Now, boy, you see me. I'm pretty low and deserted by all. And, matey, you'll bring me one noggin of rum now, won't you, matey?" I told him I would fetch my mother, but he grew impatient and demanded the rum. When I refused, he flew into a rage and struggled to rise, but sank back with a groan. "They'll have the black spot on me by now," he said. "It's my old shipmates, boy. Flint's crew, dirty dogs. But if they put the black spot on me, boy, you go to the magistrates and tell them all. The name's Captain Flint. There's some money, what I've got left, and they'll give you half of it for your trouble. You've seen Black Dog. You can't mistake him. There's no good in Black Dog now, but the rest will follow, boy. You keep your weather eye open, boy." As he talked, he grew more and more agitated, and soon his words were no more than ramblings. He lay there trembling, the sweat standing on his brow, and before I could call for help, he had fallen into a kind of stupor. I left him and went to tell my mother, who was tending to my father upstairs. Before long, the captain stirred again, and his cries of "Rum!" echoed through the inn. My mother and I agreed that we could not manage the captain alone, and so I set off to fetch Dr. Livesey. Dr. Livesey came promptly, and I led him to the captain. He listened to his chest and shook his head gravely. "The man is very ill," the doctor said. "It's a pity I can't help him without cooperation. The drink has been his undoing." The captain stirred and opened his eyes. When he saw the doctor, he seemed to understand his situation. "Doctor," he said faintly, "I've run my course." "You've run it true enough," replied Dr. Livesey. "Rum is your poison, and rum has brought you here." "Give me a chance, doctor," the captain pleaded. "Help me, and I'll tell you where Flint's gold is." The doctor raised an eyebrow, but remained firm. "I can't do anything for you unless you stop drinking." The captain grumbled, but after a long moment he nodded. Dr. Livesey prepared a treatment and left instructions with me and my mother to follow closely. That evening, as the storm rattled the shutters of the inn, there came a knock at the door. My mother opened it cautiously to reveal a blind man, shabbily dressed and leaning on a stick. His face was cruel and menacing despite his sightless eyes. "Take me to the captain," he demanded in a harsh voice. My mother hesitated, but he struck out with his stick, forcing his way in. "Lead me to him, boy," he barked at me. Terrified, I obeyed and guided him to the captain's chair. The blind man seized the captain's hand and pressed something into it. "That's for you, Bill," he said. "The black spot. You've till 10 tonight." With that, he turned and hobbled out of the inn. The captain stared at the small, round object in his hand. His face went as pale as death, and he began to tremble violently. "The black spot!" he cried. "I'm a marked man, boy. They'll come for me now." I asked what it meant, but he was too far gone in his terror to answer. Instead, he clutched his chest and collapsed into his chair. Ran to fetch my mother, and together we tried to rouse the captain, but it was no use. He had fallen into some kind of fit, and no effort of ours could bring him back to his senses. After a while, his breathing grew weaker and weaker, until at last it stopped altogether. The captain was dead. My mother was resolute. "We'll have no dealings with that dreadful crew," she said. "But we'll not lose what is owed to us either. I mean to open his chest and take what he owes us for his lodging. Let's find the key." The key was not on the captain, so we turned to the sea chest. It was large and heavy, reinforced with iron bands and locked tight. My mother was determined to open it, and I had to agree with her. There might be danger in leaving it untouched, and we needed the money. We found a key tied around the captain's neck on a string. I hesitated before unlocking the chest, feeling a strange mix of curiosity and dread, but my mother urged me on. Inside the chest we found a variety of strange items: a suit of fine clothes, somewhat stained and worn, a collection of trinkets and curiosities from foreign lands, several gold coins, and at the very bottom, a bundle wrapped in oilcloth. My mother began to count the coins, determined to take only what was owed to her. "I'll have no blood money," she said firmly. But as she counted, a faint sound reached our ears, a tapping or perhaps the faint scrape of footsteps outside the inn. We froze. "They're coming," I whispered. "We must leave." But my mother was stubborn. "I'll not run from thieves," she said. "I'll take what we're owed and no more." The sound outside grew louder, a low murmur of voices, the clink of weapons. My mother and I looked at each other in terror. There was no time to argue. I seized the bundle from the chest, closed the lid, and urged her to flee with me. We slipped out the back door and ran down the hill toward the village. The night was dark and stormy, the wind howling in our ears. Behind us, we could hear the crashing of the inn door as the men broke in. We reached the home of Dr. Livesey and pounded on the door. He was not at home, but his servant promised to fetch him at once. We waited in fearful silence, clutching the bundle from the chest. I felt as though all the horrors of the captain's life were now descending upon us. When Dr. Livesey arrived, we explained everything: the captain's death, the black spot, and the contents of the chest. He examined the bundle and found within it a map, marked with the outline of an island and strange notations about treasure buried there. "This," he said gravely, "is the map to Captain Flint's treasure. We must act quickly. Those men won't stop until they have it." With that, we began to make plans, not realizing how dangerous and thrilling the adventure ahead of us would become. Thank you for joining me on this incredible journey. I hope this story brought you relaxation and a sense of wonder as you drifted off to sleep. If you enjoyed tonight's tale, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to Mr. Sleep Story for more soothing bedtime adventures. Share this with someone who could use a little peace and calm in their night. Until next time, may your dreams be filled with magic and your nights restful. Sleep well. I'll see you in the next story. Our story this evening was written by one of the greatest American writers in history, Mark Twain. We'll begin with his beloved classic, The Adventures of Tom Sawyer. It's a tale full of adventure, childhood mischief, and the charm of simpler times. Together, we will explore the banks of the Mississippi River, where the sound of flowing water and the spirit of youthful curiosity set the stage for relaxation. So, get cozy, snuggle under your blanket, rest your head on your pillow, and allow your mind to wander as we step into this delightful tale. Remember, you don't need to stay awake to follow the story. Just let the words carry you away to a world of peace and serenity. Now, let's begin. Tom. No answer. Tom. No answer. What's gone with that boy, I wonder? You, Tom. No answer. The old lady pulled her spectacles down and looked over them about the room. Then she put them up and looked out under them. She seldom or never looked through them for so small a thing as a boy. They were her state pair, the pride of her heart, and were built for style, not service. She could have seen through a pair of stove lids just as well. She looked perplexed for a moment, and then said, not fiercely, but still loud enough for the furniture to hear, "Well, I lay if I get hold of you, I'll—" She did not finish, for by this time she was bending down and punching under the bed with the broom, and so she needed breath to punctuate the punches with. She resurrected nothing but the cat. I never did see the beat of that boy. She went to the open door and stood in it, and looked out among the tomato vines and jimson weeds that constituted the garden. No Tom. So she lifted up her voice at an angle calculated for distance and shouted, "You, Tom!" There was a slight noise behind her, and she turned just in time to seize a small boy by the slack of his roundabout and arrest his flight. "There, I might have thought of that closet. What you been doing in there?" "Nothing." "Nothing? Look at your hands, and look at your mouth. What is that truck?" "I don't know, Aunt." "Well, I know. It's jam. That's what it is. 40 times I've said if you didn't let that jam alone, I'd skin you. Hand me that switch." The switch hovered in the air. The peril was desperate. "My, look behind you, Aunt." The old lady whirled around and snatched her skirts out of danger. The lad fled on the instant, scrambled up the high board fence and disappeared over it. His Aunt Polly stood surprised a moment, and then broke into a gentle laugh. "Hang the boy. Can't I never learn anything? Ain't he played me tricks enough like that for me to be looking out for him by this time? But old fools is the biggest fools there is. Can't learn an old dog new tricks, as the saying is. But my goodness, he never plays them alike, 2 days, and how is a body to know what's coming? He pairs to know just how long he can torment me before I get my dander up. And he knows if he can make out to put me off for a minute or make me laugh, it's all down again and I can't hit him a lick. I ain't doing my duty by that boy, and that's the Lord's truth, goodness knows. Spare the rod and spile the child, as the good book says. I'm a laying up sin and suffering for us both, I know. He's full of the old scratch, but laws o' me. He's my own dead sister's boy, poor thing, and I ain't got the heart to lash him somehow. Every time I let him off, my conscience does hurt me so, and every time I hit him, my old heart most breaks. Well, a well, man that is born of woman is of few days and full of trouble, as the scripture says, and I reckon it's so. He'll play hooky this evening, and I'll just be obliged to make him work tomorrow to punish him. It's mighty hard to make him work Saturdays, when all the boys is having holiday. but he hates work more than he hates anything else. And I've got to do some of my duty by him, or I'll be the ruination of the child. Tom did play hooky, and he had a very good time. He got back home barely in season to help Jim, the small colored boy, saw next day's wood and split the kindlings before supper. At least he was there in time to tell his adventures to Jim, while Jim did 3/4 of the work. Tom's younger brother, or rather half-brother, Sid, was already through with his part of the work, picking up chips, for he was a quiet boy and had no adventurous, troublesome ways. While Tom was eating his supper and stealing sugar as opportunity offered, Aunt Polly asked him questions that were full of guile and very deep, for she wanted to trap him into damaging revealments. Like many other simple-hearted souls, it was her pet vanity to believe she was endowed with a talent for dark and mysterious diplomacy, and she loved to contemplate a trait in herself which was nothing but a liberal and unconscious borrowing of the ideas of the other people. She said, "Tom, it was middling warm in school, warn't it?" "Yes'm." "Powerful warm, warn't it?" "Yes'm." "Didn't you want to go in a swimming, Tom?" A bit of a scare shot through Tom, a touch of uncomfortable suspicion. He searched Aunt Polly's face, but it told him nothing. So he said, "No'm, well, not very much." The old lady reached out her hand and felt Tom's shirt and said, "But you ain't too warm now, though." And it flattered her to reflect that she had discovered that the shirt was dry without anybody knowing that that was what she had in her mind. But in her honesty, she could not keep still, so she said, "But what makes you dry now when you was so warm a while ago?" Tom was in a corner now that he was sorry he had ventured into. He turned his eye upon Aunt Polly and said, "Why, bless your heart, Aunt Polly. You see, we was all a-playing, and I ran and found a little bit of water, and I sprinkled it on me. That's the way I come to be wet." "Oh, Tom, don't lie to me. I know you've been in swimming. Why wouldn't you let me hear you?" Tom looked at her hand about his collar, and said, "Now, Aunt Polly, don't make me do it, please. If I told you, you wouldn't believe me, would you?" His aunt bent over him to try to see his face, but he covered his head with his arm and sobbed out, "There now, it's no use. They all said I wouldn't tell you. They're playing hooky, Aunt Polly, and I told 'em not to." Her suspicions faded. She let go of his shirt, and Tom hugged himself in secret delight. And yet, I can't seem to catch that boy a single time to save my life. I don't know what to do with him. While Aunt Polly was pondering her next move, Tom sneaked out the back door. He made his way down the street, keeping an eye out for any sign of Sid or Aunt Polly. As he rounded the corner, he bumped straight into a new boy, a stranger in the village, judging by his fancy clothes. The two boys stared at each other, sizing each other up. The new boy was well-dressed, wearing a necktie and shoes, things Tom considered unnecessary luxuries. Tom, on the other hand, was barefoot, with a shabby hat and the air of someone who was always looking for trouble. "What are you looking at?" said the new boy. "What do you think I'm looking at?" retorted Tom. "Well, I reckon you're looking for trouble." "Maybe I am. You going to do something about it?" The boys circled each other, their tempers rising. Finally, words gave way to action, and the two fell to wrestling in the dust of the street. They rolled, tumbled, and fought with all their might, neither willing to concede defeat. Tom eventually got the upper hand, pinning the boy down. "Say enough," he demanded. "Enough!" cried the new boy, begrudgingly admitting defeat. Tom let him go, but not before making a grand show of brushing himself off as though the fight had been an easy victory. The new boy picked himself up, dusted off his clothes, and shouted, "I'll tell my big brother on you." "Go ahead," Tom called after him, grinning with satisfaction. The new boy retreated, and Tom sauntered off, feeling victorious. He made his way home, prepared to face Aunt Polly's wrath, but secretly proud of his day's adventures. Saturday morning was come, and all the summer world was bright and fresh and brimming with life. There was a song in every heart, and if the heart was young, the music issued at the lips. There was cheer in every face and a spring in every step. The locust trees were in bloom, and the fragrance of the blossoms filled the air. Cardiff Hill, beyond the village and above it, was green with vegetation, and it lay just far enough away to seem a delectable land, dreamy, reposeful, and inviting. Tom appeared on the sidewalk with a bucket of whitewash and a long-handled brush. He surveyed the fence, and all gladness left him, and a deep melancholy settled down upon his spirit. 30 yards of board fence 9 feet high. Life to him seemed hollow, and existence but a burden. Sighing, he dipped his brush and passed it along the topmost plank, repeated the operation, did it again, compared the insignificant whitewashed streak with the far-reaching continent of unwhitewashed fence, and sat down on a tree box discouraged. Jim came skipping out at the gate with a tin pail and singing Buffalo Gals. Bringing water from the town pump had always been hateful work in Tom's eyes before, but now it did not strike him so. He remembered that there was company at the pump. White, mulatto, and Negro boys and girls were always there waiting their turns, resting, trading playthings, quarreling, fighting, skylarking. And he remembered that although the pump was only 150 yards off, Jim never got back with a bucket of water under an hour. And even then, somebody generally had to go after him. Tom said, "Say, Jim, I'll fetch the water if you'll whitewash some." Jim shook his head and said, "Can't, Mars Tom. Ol' missus, she told me I got to go and get this water and not stop foolin' round wid anybody. She say she spick Mars Tom gwine to ax me to whitewash, and so she told me go long and tend to my own business. She lowed she'd attend to the whitewashin'." "Oh, never you mind what she said, Jim. That's the way she always talks. Give me the bucket. I won't be gone only a minute. She won't ever know." "Oh, I dasn't, Mars Tom. Ol' missus she'd take and tar the head off'n me. 'Deed she would. She never licks anybody. Whacks 'em over the head with her thimble. And who cares for that? I'd like to know. She talks awful, but talk don't hurt. Anyways, it don't if she don't cry. Jim, I'll give you a marvel. I'll give you a white alley." Jim began to waver. "White alley, Jim, and it's a bully taw. My, that's a mighty gay marvel, I tell you. But Mars, Tom I's powerful 'fraid ol' missus. And besides, if you will, I'll show you my sore toe." Jim was only human. This attraction was too much for him. He put down his pail, took the white alley, and bent over the toe with absorbing interest while the bandage was being unwound. In another moment he was flying down the street with his pail and a tingling rear. Tom was whitewashing with vigor, and Aunt Polly was retiring from the field with a slipper in her hand and triumph in her eye. But Tom's energy did not last. He began to think of the fun he had planned for this day, and his sorrows multiplied. Soon the free boys would come tripping along on all sorts of delicious expeditions, and they would make a world of fun of him for having to work. The very thought of it burnt him like fire. He got out his worldly wealth and examined it. Bits of toys, marbles, and trash. Enough to buy an exchange of work, maybe, but not half enough to buy so much as half an hour of pure freedom. So he returned his straitened means to his pocket and gave up the idea of trying to buy the boys. At this dark and hopeless moment, an inspiration burst upon him. Nothing less than a great, magnificent inspiration. He took up his brush and went tranquilly to work. Ben Rogers hove in sight presently, the very boy of all boys whose ridicule he had been dreading. Ben's gait was the hop, skip, and jump, proof enough that his heart was light and his anticipations high. He was eating an apple and giving a long melodious whoop at intervals, followed by a deep-toned ding-dong-dong, ding-dong-dong, for he was personating a steamboat. As he drew near, he slackened speed, took the middle of the street, leaned far over to starboard, and rounded to ponderously and with laborious pomp and circumstance. For he was personating the big Missouri, and considered himself to be drawing 9 feet of water. He was boat and captain and engine bells combined, so he had to imagine himself standing on his own hurricane deck, giving the orders and executing them. "Stop her, sir! Ting-a-ling-ling!" The headway ran almost out, and he drew up slowly toward the sidewalk. "Ship up to back! Ting-a-ling-ling!" His arms straightened and stiffened down his sides. "Set her back on the starboard! Ting-a-ling-ling! Chow! Cha-chow, wow! Chow!" His right hand, meantime, describing stately circles, for it was representing a 40-foot wheel. "Let her go back on the larboard. Ting-a-ling-ling. Chow-chow-chow." The left hand began to describe circles. "Stop the starboard. Ting-a-ling-ling. Stop the larboard. Come ahead on the starboard. Stop her. Let your outside turn over slow. Ting-a-ling-ling. Chow-ow-ow. Get out that headline. Lively now. Come, out with your spring line. What are you about there? Take a turn round that stump with the bite of it. Stand by that stage now. Let her go. Done with the engines, sir. Ting-a-ling-ling. Shut, shut, shut." Trying the gauge cocks. Tom went on whitewashing, paid no attention to the steamboat. Ben stared a moment and then said, "Hi, yi. You're up a stump, ain't you?" No answer. Tom surveyed his last touch with the eye of an artist. Then he gave his brush another gentle sweep and surveyed the result as before. Ben ranged up alongside of him. Tom's mouth watered for the apple, but he stuck to his work. Ben said, "Hello, old chap. You gotta work, hey?" Tom wheeled suddenly and said, "Why, it's you, Ben. I weren't noticing." "Say, I'm going in a swimming, I am. Don't you wish you could? But of course you'd druther work, wouldn't you? Course you would." Tom contemplated the boy a bit and said, "What do you call work?" "Why, ain't that work?" Tom resumed his whitewashing and answered carelessly, "Well, maybe it is, and maybe it ain't. All I know is, it suits Tom Sawyer." "Oh, come now. You don't mean to let on that you like it?" The brush continued to move. "Like it? Well, I don't see why I oughtn't to like it. Does a boy get a chance to whitewash a fence every day?" That put the thing in a new light. Ben stopped nibbling his apple. Tom swept his brush daintily back and forth, stepped back to note the effect, added a touch here and there, criticized the effect again. Ben watched every move and got more and more interested, more and more absorbed. Presently he said, "Say, Tom, let me whitewash a little." Tom considered, was about to consent, but he altered his mind. No, I reckon it wouldn't hardly do, Ben. You see, Aunt Polly's awful particular about this fence, right here on the street, you know. But if it was the back fence, I wouldn't mind, and she wouldn't. Yes, she's awful particular about this fence. It's got to be done very careful. I reckon there ain't one boy in 1,000, maybe 2,000, that can do it the way it's got to be done. No, is that so? Oh, come now, let me just try. Only just a little. I'd let you, if you was me, Tom. Ben, I'd like to, honest Injun. But Aunt Polly, well, Jim wanted to do it, but she wouldn't let him. Sid wanted to do it, and she wouldn't let Sid. Now, don't you see how I'm fixed? If he was to tackle this fence and anything was to happen to it, oh, shucks, I'll be just as careful. Now let me try. Say, I'll give you the core of my apple. Well, here, no, Ben, now don't. I'm afeard. I'll give you all of it. Tom gave up the brush with reluctance in his face, but alacrity in his heart. And while the late steamer Big Missouri worked and sweated in the sun, the retired artist sat on a barrel in the shade close by, dangled his legs, munched his apple, and planned the slaughter of more innocents. There was no lack of material. Boys happened along every little while. They came to jeer, but remained to whitewash. By the time Ben was fagged out, Tom had traded the next chance to Billy Fisher for a kite, in good repair. And when he played out, Johnny Miller bought in for a dead rat and a string to swing it with. And so on, hour after hour. And when the middle of the afternoon came, from being a poor, poverty-stricken boy in the morning, Tom was literally rolling in wealth. He had, besides the things before mentioned, 12 marbles, part of a Jew's harp, a piece of blue bottle glass to look through, a spool cannon, a key that wouldn't unlock anything, a fragment of chalk, a glass stopper of a decanter, a tin soldier, a couple of tadpoles, 6 firecrackers, a kitten with only one eye, a brass doorknob, a dog collar, but no dog, the handle of a knife, 4 pieces of orange peel, and a dilapidated old window sash. He had had a nice, good, idle time all the while, plenty of company, and the fence had 3 coats of whitewash on it. If he hadn't run out of whitewash, he would have bankrupted every boy in the village. Tom said to himself that it was not such a hollow world after all. He had discovered a great law of human action without knowing it. Namely, that in order to make a man or a boy covet a thing, it is only necessary to make the thing difficult to attain. If he had been a great and wise philosopher, like the writer of this book, he would now have comprehended that work consists of whatever a body is obliged to do, and that play consists of whatever a body is not obliged to do. And this would help him to understand why constructing artificial flowers or performing on a treadmill is work, while rolling 10 pins or climbing Mont Blanc is only amusement. There are wealthy gentlemen in England who drive 4-horse passenger coaches 20 or 30 miles on a daily line in the summer, because the privilege costs them considerable money. But if they were offered wages for the service, that would turn it into work, and then they would resign. Tom Sawyer went to bed that night with his pockets full of treasures and an ache in his heart for the more things he had coveted and failed to secure. He had had a long, hot, wearying day, and when he crept to his rest at last, his soul was satisfied with the day's adventures. But he was not happy, for his greed and ambition had been aroused. He was, however, in the beginning stages of a career that was destined to be marked by much cunning and many triumphs. He said to himself that he would be a pirate. He would sail the seas, pillage ships, and hoard treasure. But for now, he was content to dream. Tom presented himself before Aunt Polly, who was sitting by an open window in a pleasant rearward apartment, which was bedroom, breakfast room, dining room, and library combined. The balmy summer air, the restful quiet, the odor of the flowers, and the drowsing murmur of the bees had had their effect, and she was nodding over her knitting, for she had no company but the cat, and it was asleep in her lap. Her spectacles were propped up on her gray head for safety. She had thought that of course Tom had deserted long ago, and she wondered at seeing him place himself in her power again in this intrepid way. He said, "Mayn't I go and play now, Aunt?" "What, already? How much have you done?" "It's all done, Aunt." "Tom, don't lie to me. I can't bear it." "I ain't, Aunt. It is all done." Aunt Polly placed small trust in such evidence. She went out to see for herself, and she would have been content to find 20% of Tom's statement true. When she found the entire fence whitewashed, and not only whitewashed but elaborately coated and recoated, and even a streak added to the ground, her astonishment was almost unspeakable. She said, "Well, I never. There's no getting around it. You can work when you're a mind to, Tom." And then she diluted the compliment by adding, "But it's powerful seldom you're a mind to, I'm bound to say. Well, go long and play, but mind you get back some time in a week or I'll tan you." She was so overcome by the splendor of his achievement that she took him into the closet and selected a choice apple and delivered it to him, along with an improving lecture upon the added value and flavor a treat took to itself when it came without sin through virtuous effort. And, while she closed with a happy scriptural flourish, he hooked a donut. Then he skipped out and saw Sid just starting up the outside stairway that led to the back rooms on the second floor. Clods were handy, and the air was full of them in a twinkling. They raged around Sid like a hailstorm, and before Aunt Polly could collect her surprised faculties and sally to the rescue, 6 or 7 clods had taken personal effect, and Tom was over the fence and gone. There was a gate, but as a general thing he was too crowded for time to make use of it. His soul was at peace, now that he had settled with Sid for calling attention to his black thread and getting him into trouble. Tom skirted the block and came round into a muddy alley that led behind the village. He was beyond the reach of capture now, and he skipped out, as he called it, and went whistling down the alley with his mouth full of harmony and his soul full of gratitude. He bent his steps toward the public square, for he was having it out with some other boys who were hatching a war. By the time Tom arrived, there was already a small war party formed under the leadership of Joe Harper, who declared himself the general. Tom joined them, and the boys split into 2 sides, with Tom commanding the opposing faction. They reenacted scenes of heroic battles, charging each other with sticks for swords and dirt clods for cannonballs. Tom fought valiantly, relishing the glory, even as his followers pretended dramatic deaths. At last, when the battle was over, Tom felt victorious and satisfied. As Tom left the battlefield, feeling triumphant, he wandered toward the public square, where his eyes caught sight of a new girl in town. She was a lovely little creature with blue eyes, golden hair plaited into 2 long tails, and the prettiest dress he had ever seen. She was standing in the yard of her house, and Tom stopped in his tracks, staring at her. He had never seen anyone like her before. His heart began to thump, and a new sensation took hold of him. Tom was smitten. The girl glanced at him for a moment, and then turned away with a toss of her head. She ran into the house, leaving Tom standing there, utterly enchanted. He stayed rooted to the spot, hoping she would come out again. She did, after a little while, holding a pansy in her hand. She walked up and down the garden path, pretending not to see him, but Tom was not to be ignored. He began to show off, standing on his head, turning somersaults and performing all sorts of ridiculous antics to win her attention. For a moment, the girl seemed unimpressed, but eventually she sneaked a glance at him, and Tom felt encouraged. He pulled out his most daring trick, walking along the top of the fence. It was a risky maneuver, but Tom managed to pull it off, and when he jumped to the ground, he saw that she was clapping her hands and laughing. Before he could speak to her, she turned and ran back into the house. Tom was beside himself. He waited for what felt like hours, but was only a few minutes, hoping she would reappear. When she didn't, he sighed heavily and began to walk away, but not before drawing a large heart in the dirt and writing "Tom vs. Becky" inside it with a stick. That night, Tom lay awake thinking about the girl. He didn't even know her name yet, but he was determined to find out. She was the most beautiful thing he had ever seen, and he felt certain that he would love her forever. The next day, at school, Tom was inattentive and dreamy. He barely noticed when his teacher scolded him for not knowing his lessons. His thoughts were consumed with visions of the new girl and how he might win her heart. When the noon bell rang, signaling the start of recess, Tom raced outside, hoping to catch a glimpse of her. As luck would have it, she was there, standing near the schoolyard fence. Tom approached her cautiously, trying to look casual. "Hello?" he said, his voice trembling slightly. She looked at him shyly. "Hello," she replied. "What's your name?" he asked. "Becky Thatcher," she said. "I'm Tom Sawyer," he said, puffing up his chest a little. "Do you like marbles?" "Yes," she said, smiling. Tom's heart soared. He pulled a handful of marbles from his pocket and began showing them off, explaining which ones were his favorites and how he had won them. Becky seemed impressed, and before long the two of them were laughing and talking as if they had known each other forever. When the bell rang, calling them back to class, Tom felt as if he were walking on air. Becky Thatcher liked him, and he was determined to make her his girl. The sun rose upon a tranquil world and beamed down upon the peaceful village like a benediction. Breakfast was on the table, and Aunt Polly was at her post, seeing that all who came were properly supplied with wholesome provisions. Tom appeared in his Sunday clothes and looked over the articles of his costume with the air of one who felt that life was on a solid footing now, and who was prepared to meet its requirements. He had been restless and full of chafings and repinings, conscience-smitten too. He could not meet Amy Lawrence's eye. He could not brook her loving gaze. But when he saw Becky Thatcher's coquettish little face peeping out at him from behind her mother's shoulder, he quickly forgot the lesser griefs of life. He threw himself upon his book with an earnestness that almost delighted the teacher. He kept the end of a long stick in his mouth, chewing it with relish. He was charmed to see how all his worldly troubles slipped away under its soothing influence. Presently, his mind wandered to the farthest ends of the earth, where distant seas rolled in unfathomable mystery. and where the storm-lashed billows dashed madly upon the craggy shores. He saw himself as a fearless pirate, scudding over the waves and conquering islands with the same reckless abandon as his heroes of old. The tension broke with the striking of the bell, calling the class to order. Tom Sawyer stepped into the classroom and took his seat at the head of the line. There was a hush of expectation as the teacher entered, his long coat brushing the floor. He held a Bible in one hand and a hymnal in the other, and his stern countenance bore an air of solemn gravity. He called upon the children to rise and recite their lessons, and they obeyed with trembling voices. Tom's mind wandered during the recitations, and he spent the time devising schemes to capture Becky Thatcher's attention. Finally, his turn came, and he rose to his feet, but his thoughts were so jumbled that he could scarcely remember the words. He stammered and stumbled, and the teacher frowned in disappointment. Tom slumped back into his seat, feeling humiliated. At the close of the lesson, the teacher announced that there would be a prize awarded to the student who could recite the most Bible verses from memory. Tom had heard of this prize before. It was a richly bound Bible with gilt edges and a crimson ribbon, the envy of every child in the village. He had never imagined that he might win it, but now the possibility seemed tantalizingly within his grasp. Tom looked around the room and saw that the other children were busy studying their verses. He realized that he would need to work harder than ever if he hoped to claim the prize. He bent over his book and began to read, but the words blurred before his eyes, and his mind wandered once again. Tom struggled to focus on his Bible verses, but his mischievous nature got the better of him. He began whispering and trading small trinkets with other children in the classroom, including bits of chalk, marbles, and fishhooks. Tom was bartering for yellow tickets, which were given to students as rewards for memorizing verses. 10 yellow tickets could be exchanged for a red ticket, and 10 red tickets for a blue one. Collecting enough blue tickets would earn the prize Bible. Tom's cunning plan unfolded as he amassed enough tickets through trades and bribes to qualify for the prize, without actually learning the required verses. When the teacher announced that a visitor, Judge Thatcher, Becky Thatcher's father, was present, the excitement in the room heightened. Judge Thatcher was a distinguished man, respected by everyone in the village, and his approval carried great weight. The teacher, eager to impress Judge Thatcher, called for Tom to step forward as a shining example of the Sunday school's success. Tom walked up, flushed with a mixture of pride and dread. He was handed the prize Bible, and Judge Thatcher looked at him approvingly. "My boy, you ought to be very proud of yourself," said the judge. "Now, can you tell us the names of the first 2 disciples?" Tom's face turned pale. He hadn't anticipated such a test. He shifted uncomfortably and stammered, "David and Goliath." The entire class erupted in laughter, and the teacher's face turned crimson with embarrassment. Judge Thatcher, struggling to maintain his composure, smiled weakly and said, "Well, no matter. The boy's effort is commendable." Tom returned to his seat with the prized Bible, but his triumph felt hollow. He could feel Becky Thatcher's eyes on him, and he wondered if she was impressed or mortified by his blunder. Either way, Tom's ambition and knack for mischief had made him the center of attention once again. Thank you for joining me tonight. I hope this story has brought you peace and comfort. If you'd like to continue exploring classic tales or peaceful bedtime stories, be sure to join us again here at Mr. Sleep Story. Sweet dreams and good night.